The frontier wars in Tasmania left scars that did not vanish with the cessation of armed conflict in the 1830s. By the late 19th century of the Common Era, the narrative of extinction had been firmly entrenched in public consciousness, shaping not only policy but also collective memory. Aboriginal Tasmanians were framed as a people whose story had ended, and the colonial state sought to codify this through law, census data, and public education. However, survival persisted quietly in isolated communities, particularly on the Bass Strait Islands, as families maintained kinship networks, cultural practices, and connections to country despite systemic attempts to erase them. The mid-20th century marked a slow, uneven challenge to this narrative. Returned Indigenous servicemen after the Second World War, alongside younger generations educated outside the reserves, began questioning the state-sanctioned accounts of extinction. By the 1950s, anthropologists and historians were increasingly confronted with evidence contradicting official claims. Archival records, oral histories, and surviving families made clear that Aboriginal Tasmanians had endured, even if invisibly, and that the myth of extinction served political ends. It justified the appropriation of land, the neglect of social services, and the absence of moral accountability. Throughout the 1960s, social and political movements across Australia brought attention to Indigenous rights, culminating in the landmark 1967 referendum. Although the focus was national, Tasmania's Aboriginal communities were directly impacted. The referendum allowed them to be officially counted and acknowledged. This shift in legal and social recognition began to dismantle the institutional invisibility that had persisted for over a century. Local activism, particularly around land and heritage, grew steadily, aiming to restore both tangible property and intangible cultural memory. The struggle was not simply for symbolic recognition, but for the right to exist in a society that had repeatedly declared them absent. During the same period, Tasmania faced increasing scrutiny over the treatment of Aboriginal remains and cultural artifacts collected in the 19th century. Museums, universities, and private collectors held bones, tools, and other objects, often acquired without consent from the communities themselves. Activists and scholars argued that these collections represented ongoing violence, a continuation of the frontier wars through scientific and institutional means. By the early 1970s, legal challenges and public campaigns demanded the repatriation of these items, highlighting the ethical responsibility of Australian institutions and the enduring consequences of past policies. At the heart of this struggle was the tension between official memory and lived experience. While textbooks and government reports frequently maintained that Aboriginal Tasmanians were extinct, families on the islands and in mainland settlements continued to pass down language fragments, stories, and survival skills. Seasonal movements, fishing, mutton birding, and traditional ceremonies persisted clandestinely, sustaining cultural identity. These acts of endurance challenged the very notion of historical finality, proving that survival had never truly ended. By the mid-1970s, the combined effects of activism, scholarship, and political change signaled a turning point. Aboriginal Tasmanians began to assert their presence in public forums, reclaiming history that had been denied for generations. Commemorations, local museums, and educational programs started to integrate Indigenous perspectives, gradually correcting the narrative of erasure. The story of Tasmania was no longer solely a record of colonial conquest and disappearance. It was becoming a history of resilience, justice-seeking, and the long-term struggle to maintain identity in the face of systemic attempts to erase it. In this first part of Video 5, the foundation is set for understanding how the legacies of the frontier wars persisted through legal, cultural, and institutional forms. The next part will explore the concrete processes of legal recognition, land return, and political advocacy that reshaped Tasmania's social and historical landscape during the late 20th century, demonstrating how survival evolved into justice. The late 20th century of the Common Era marked a decisive shift in the story of Aboriginal Tasmanians. For more than a century, official records had depicted them as extinct, and public institutions had perpetuated this narrative. However, beginning in the 1970s, Aboriginal communities, scholars, and activists began to challenge these long-standing assumptions, demanding recognition, restitution, and justice. This period became one of profound transformation, as survival evolved into assertion, and silence into political and cultural reclamation. In 1976, the Tasmanian government formally recognised the existence of Aboriginal communities, acknowledging descendants who had survived the frontier wars and subsequent relocations. This recognition was not merely symbolic, it allowed Aboriginal Tasmanians to engage with the legal system, claim rights to land and cultural sites, and participate in programs that had been historically denied. It also challenged the entrenched myth of extinction, forcing Tasmanian society to confront uncomfortable truths about the colonial past and the mechanisms of erasure. One of the central arenas of struggle during this era was land rights. Sites of exile, such as Wybalena and Oyster Cove, were not only historical locations but also deeply symbolic. In 1983, Wybalena was returned to Aboriginal ownership, marking a critical moment in the process of restitution. Oyster Cove followed in 1995. These returns were more than transfers of property, they represented a restoration of cultural memory and acknowledgement of historical injustice. They allowed Aboriginal Tasmanians to reconnect with ancestral lands that had been forcibly taken from them, and to reassert custodianship over landscapes that held deep spiritual and historical significance. Simultaneously, efforts to reclaim and preserve culture gained momentum. Aboriginal communities, often in collaboration with historians and anthropologists, began documenting oral histories, reviving language, and conducting ceremonies that had persisted clandestinely for decades. Museums and academic institutions were pressured to return ancestral remains and artifacts. Legal cases challenged the ownership and ethical stewardship of these items, bringing attention to the fact that the legacy of the frontier wars extended beyond the battlefield. It lived on in the control and commodification of indigenous bodies and cultural property. The 1980s and 1990s also witnessed growing public awareness and media coverage. Television documentaries, newspaper articles, and scholarly publications highlighted the survival and resilience of Aboriginal Tasmanians, exposing the false narrative of extinction. Educational curricula began to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, and local commemorations recognized the victims of the frontier wars. This period was not without conflict. Debates over identity, authenticity, and representation were heated, reflecting the lingering tension between the historical record and lived experience. By the late 1990s, the narrative had shifted substantially. Aboriginal Tasmanians were no longer invisible in law or society. Recognition, while incomplete, had transformed the social landscape. Families previously marginalized by the state were now visible, asserting their history and rights. Importantly, this recognition also reframed Tasmania's understanding of its own past. The frontier wars were no longer distant or abstract. They were acknowledged as a foundational and violent episode that had shaped the colony's development and contemporary social relations. Yet, even as recognition progressed, the legacies of dispossession, cultural disruption, and institutional neglect remained. Generational trauma persisted, and many challenges related to identity, land, and cultural preservation continued to require attention. Nevertheless, the period from the 1970s through the 1990s marked a clear transition, from denial to acknowledgement, from survival to active reclamation, and from erasure to justice-seeking. Aboriginal Tasmanians had moved from being a silenced people to agents of historical memory and cultural continuity. This second part of Video 5 establishes the legal, political, and cultural framework that allowed Aboriginal Tasmanians to reclaim space in the historical and social consciousness of Tasmania. The final part will explore the outcomes of these struggles, focusing on contemporary recognition, reconciliation efforts, and the ongoing negotiation of historical memory into the 21st century. By the 1990s, the historical narrative of Aboriginal Tasmania had shifted dramatically. Recognition of surviving families, legal restitution of lands, and public acknowledgement of past violence laid the foundation for a new era. Institutions, including museums, universities, and government archives, were compelled to reconsider how they represented Aboriginal history. Collections of human remains, artifacts, and cultural items were increasingly returned to communities, marking an ethical reckoning that connected past injustices to contemporary responsibilities. In 1995, Oyster Cove, the final site of forced settlement and displacement, was officially handed over to the Aboriginal community. This event symbolized the restoration of both land and cultural memory. Descendants could now practice ceremonies, maintain connections to ancestral sites, and educate future generations about their heritage. The act also challenged the enduring myth of extinction, it was tangible evidence that Aboriginal Tasmanians had survived and continued to assert their identity despite generations of systemic oppression. The late 20th century also saw the emergence of formal reconciliation efforts in Tasmania. Educational programs were developed to teach students about the frontier wars, Wyberlena, Oyster Cove, and the broader history of colonial violence. Commemorative events honored the victims of these conflicts, integrating Indigenous perspectives that had been historically suppressed. Oral histories, previously the sole means of preserving memory, were documented, published, and archived, providing authoritative testimony to counter centuries of erasure. Meanwhile, public policy began to address structural inequalities. Aboriginal organizations advocated for housing, healthcare, and employment programs that recognized the unique history of Tasmanian communities. The focus was not solely on symbolic justice, but on practical measures to improve living conditions while restoring cultural dignity. Advocacy extended to national levels, aligning with broader movements for Indigenous rights across Australia. Entering the 21st century, Aboriginal Tasmanians continued to challenge historical and contemporary injustices. Repatriation of ancestral remains remained a central concern, with ceremonies accompanying the return of bones and artifacts from institutions in Australia and overseas. Cultural revival efforts expanded, encompassing language revitalization, art, storytelling, and land-based programs that reconnected communities to traditional country. These initiatives underscored the continuity of culture and resilience in the face of historical trauma. The ongoing struggle also includes confronting public perceptions and narratives. While textbooks, museums, and media once perpetuated the myth of extinction, contemporary scholarship and activism demand accuracy, respect, and engagement with living communities. Aboriginal Tasmanians assert that their history is not confined to the past. It shapes identity, policy, and social relations in the present. The frontier wars are no longer merely a historical chapter. They are part of a living conversation about justice, memory, and recognition. Today, descendants of the original Aboriginal population of Tasmania continue to navigate the legacies of colonization. Survival has transformed into active participation in society, politics, and cultural life. Land ownership, heritage management, education, and political advocacy remain central to community efforts. This ongoing process reflects a broader truth. While the frontier wars formally ended over 180 years ago, their consequences reverberate through generations, requiring sustained acknowledgement, remembrance, and action. In conclusion, Video 5 documents the transition from survival under erasure to recognition, justice, and cultural resurgence. It highlights the resilience of Aboriginal Tasmanians, the persistence of historical memory, and the continuing work necessary to reconcile past violence with present and future aspirations. The story of Tasmania's Indigenous people demonstrates that survival is not simply biological. It is cultural, political, and moral, enduring across centuries and into contemporary society.